Nigeria's pledge to reach net zero emissions by 2060 represents a significant step towards global climate leadership. With the federal government's 60 billion naira commitment to this cause, there is a pressing need for effective implementation strategies, particularly through initiatives like the Green Bond Program. It is essential to recognize the urgency of addressing climate change in Africa, where the impacts are increasingly severe. Despite the region's vulnerability to climate disasters, climate finance inflows to Africa remain disproportionately low, hindering efforts to meet commitments outlined in the Paris Agreement. I am now joined by Brent, climate change expert and director at ETK Group. Thank you, Brent, for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Same here. Now, let's look at this. How does Nigeria's pledge to reach, net zero emissions by 2060 compare to what is obtainable globally, and how ambitious would you say this is?
Well, there's a website called climateactiontracker.org, and it looks at different countries' commitments to achieving net zero. When you look at Nigeria's commitment, they rate them as the policies in action as being insufficient to achieve or to maintain global temperature rises to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. If you look at policies alone, they're determined to be almost sufficient. So what that says is that the policies that Nigeria has put in place are likely to result in maintaining global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. If you look at policies in action, so what's being done is determined to be insufficient. So I think there's certainly there's ambition there. I think that the ambition probably needs to be acted on a bit more in order for those temperature rises to be limited.
Well, speaking on what you just said about, there is the ambition, but we need to act more on it. The Nigerian government is committing 60 billion naira to this cause. That we know. And some have said that it is about, about how far that the government has gone. So looking at all of this, I want you to speak to, the strategy that the government is employing and how to make this even more efficient and effective.
Yeah. So the 60 billion that was just announced represents the third green bond that Nigeria has issued. The first in 2017 for 11 billion, the second in 2019 for 15 billion. So there has certainly been significant capital deployed. The government also estimates that in order to achieve net zero by 2060, it will need to spend 1.9 trillion US. So that's 410 billion above existing expenditures. So the need is really substantial. And when we talk about those green bond issuances, by the way, that's in Naira. So 11 billion, 15 billion, 60 billion issuance in green bonds. The need is 1.9 trillion US. So there's really a significant need there in terms of funding to achieve these objectives. The government has put out a very comprehensive plan in terms of how it intends to address climate change. The energy transition plan looks at the 5 largest contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and has plans in place for how to reduce those. So the plan is there. The identification of the required funding is there. The funding has not necessarily been forthcoming, I think, to get there. I think the good news is that if you look at the plans that they put in place, they're quite specific, they're quite concrete. It gives very clear actions about what needs to be done. So I think that helps Nigeria to make the case to the international community about how the funds should be made available and how they should be spent.
Maybe I should play the devil's advocate here. Now, I understand the call for more action towards mitigating the effects of climate change, not just in Nigeria, but also in Africa. Yet I have heard many industry leaders in Africa say that climate change may be an existential threat. However, they say poverty, insecurity, hunger, and poor infrastructure are even more so. So how do we strike a balance here, especially seeing the underdevelopment, the lack of infrastructure, the energy poverty in this part of the world?
Yeah. Well, I would say that you can't make a choice to do one or the other. You have to do both. And in actual fact, 90 million Nigerians are without access to power. That's a significant problem, and it's an impediment to economic development of the country. That has to be addressed. But that can be addressed without necessarily increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So what needs to happen is there needs to be a determination about how you can achieve both of these goals: industrialization, but sustainable industrialization; growth, but sustainable growth; growth that doesn't result in increased greenhouse gas emissions. This is possible. It requires some significant changes in the way things are done. It requires investment. But I would say that you can't choose to address one and not the other. Agriculture is another really good example. Hunger is a problem. Hunger needs to be addressed. Lack of food security needs to be addressed. But if you try and solve the problem as it is today, with climate change, the problem is likely to be significantly different from what it is currently. So you need to look at how you're growing food and ways where it might be subject to water stress. So you have to rethink agriculture so that you're taking into consideration the real challenges that climate change is going to be posing.
All right, let's look at COP28 now. The global stocktake is considered, the central outcome of COP28. It calls on parties to take action towards achieving, at a global scale, a tripling of renewable energy capacity, doubling energy efficiency improvements by 2030. Now, that list also includes accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power, phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies — Nigeria has done that anyway — and other measures that drive the transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, with developed countries continuing to take the lead. Now, this is Africa, where energy poverty continues to impact the standard of living of citizens. What should a just, inclusive, and equitable transition entail here in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, that is the $64,000 question, or in the case of Nigeria, the $1.9 trillion question. Look, I mean, the reality is that so much of national income in Nigeria comes from the oil and gas industry.
Exactly.
So how can you shift away from that heavy dependence on hard currency coming into the country from oil and gas in a way that also meets the country's commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So what does a fair and equitable transition look like? Well, I think that the reality is that there will need to be a very, very aggressive focus on shift towards large-scale renewables. I think everyone sees what the answer is. You can't be building more coal-fired power plants. You can't continue to rely even on cleaner burning natural gas. You have to shift towards large-scale renewables. So how does that get funded? I think that's the question that needs to be addressed. There's certainly plenty of discussions going on about that. Nigeria made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% from 2010 levels. With additional commitment from the international community, that commitment goes up to 47%. So there's really a very clear ambition. There's a clear desire to see more sustainable, at-scale energy production. Who pays for it is still the outstanding question.
Well, thank you so much, Brent. We just have to leave this conversation here. There's a lot more to talk about. I guess we'll talk about it some other time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.